Good evening, dear listener. Welcome to this quiet corner of storytelling. Make yourself comfortable, perhaps with a warm cup of tea cradled in your hands, the steam rising softly, carrying the faint scent of chamomile or Earl Grey. Let your shoulders ease, your breathing slow. Tonight, we have a gentle mystery, one that asks for nothing more than your relaxed attention. If these peaceful tales bring you comfort, do consider subscribing for more soothing mysteries to drift off with. Now settle in and let us begin. In the gentle village of St. Mary Mead, where days unfold like the slow turning of well-worn pages, a small brass key lay unnoticed on a garden path one autumn morning. It was an ordinary key, slightly tarnished, with a plain round bow and a single ward. Yet it did not belong where it lay. And because it was misplaced, or someone would never open a certain door again. Chapter 1. The Quiet Beginning. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair beside the sitting-room window, the one with the faded chintz cover that had once been bright with roses, but now wore the soft patina of many peaceful years. A small woolen shawl lay across her lap. Soft grey wool, the color of morning mist, and her needles moved with the slow, steady rhythm of someone who had long ago mastered the art of knitting without needing to watch every stitch. She was making it for young Mrs. Price, whose first baby was expected any day now. The shawl would be warm, light, and just large enough to wrap a newborn snugly against autumn chills. The late September afternoon light came through the lace curtains in pale, gentle bars, falling across the small polished oak table at her side. On the table rested her afternoon tea tray, a single porcelain cup painted with tiny violets, half full of weak Indian tea with a slice of lemon, a thin wedge of seed cake, golden and fragrant with caraway, and 3 plain digestive biscuits, arranged neatly on a matching plate. Everything was as it should be, simple, unhurried, comforting. Beyond the window stretched Miss Marple's own small garden, still holding on to summer in its quiet way. The hybrid tea roses, Peace and Queen Elizabeth, continued to produce blooms despite the shortening days, their petals a tender pink and cream against the darkening green of the leaves. The lavender bushes along the path nodded sleepily in the breeze, releasing faint perfume whenever a leaf brushed another. A thrush hopped across the lawn, or pausing now and then to listen for worms beneath the grass. It was the sort of afternoon that invited one to sit still and simply be. Earlier that morning, Miss Marple had taken her usual slow walk along the lane that wound past the church and the row of almshouses toward the post office. She never hurried. There was no need. The village of St. Mary Mead had its own tempo, gentle and unchanging, and she had long since learned to match it. She wore her second-best tweed coat, the one with the velvet collar, and sensible laced shoes that made no sound on the gravel. In her left hand, she carried a string bag containing 2 library books to return and a letter to post. In her right, a stick, not because she needed it for support, but because it was useful for pointing out interesting plants or gently moving aside nettles. The lane was quiet, and as lanes in small villages often are mid-morning. A milk float had rattled past earlier, its driver whistling tunelessly. Now only the occasional bicycle whirred by, ridden by a schoolboy or a housewife returning from the shops. Miss Marple greeted everyone she met with the same small, courteous nod and the same pleasant good morning, whether she knew their name or not. Most people smiled back. She had lived here long enough that even newcomers soon learned her face. It was near the gate of Ivy Cottage that she noticed it. Ivy Cottage stood a little back from the lane, half hidden behind a low stone wall and a screen of tall hollyhocks that had gone to seed but still held their dried stalks proudly. The house itself was modest, red brick, late Victorian, with a slate roof and white painted woodwork that always looked freshly done. Roses climbed the front wall in disciplined rows. The lawn was clipped short, the gravel path swept clean. Mr. Edwin Hargrove, who had lived there alone since his sister's death 5 years earlier, was a man of precise habits. Retired solicitor, 73 years old, churchwarden, member of the parish council, and a quiet but reliable presence at every village function. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when he did, his words were measured and kind. Miss Marple had passed him only 3 days earlier, near the Lich Gate after morning service. He had raised his hat and said, "Fine morning, Miss Marple," in his usual calm voice. She had replied, "Very pleasant indeed, Mr. Hargrove," and they had gone their separate ways. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet this morning, as she walked by the same gate, something caught the light among the fallen leaves that carpeted the public footpath just outside his boundary wall. She paused. It was small, no larger than her thumb, half covered by a single yellow sycamore leaf. A glint of brass. She bent slowly, careful of her back, and lifted the leaf aside with the tip of her stick. There it lay, an ordinary house key, slightly tarnished, with a plain round bow and a short shaft ending in a single simple word. No tag, no label, no distinguishing mark of any kind, just a key. Miss Marple straightened, turned the key over in her gloved palm, and studied it for a long moment. It was not new. The edges were worn smooth from use, yet it did not look as though it had lain there for weeks. The brass still held a faint shine where the light touched it, and someone had dropped it recently, perhaps that very morning or the evening before. She glanced towards the gate of Ivy Cottage. It was closed, latched as always. The front door beyond it stood shut, the windows curtained in their usual tidy fashion. No sign of disturbance, no open window, no broken latch, no footprint in the soft earth beside the wall. Everything appeared perfectly in order. And yet the key lay here, on the public path, outside the gate. A small thing, easily missed by most passers-by. A child might have kicked it aside without noticing. A hurried walker might have trodden on it. But Miss Marple had noticed. She always noticed the things that were just slightly out of place. With the calm deliberation that marked everything she did, she opened her string bag, slipped the key inside next to the library books, and continued her walk to the post office. She posted her letter, returned the books, purchased a book of stamps, and exchanged a few quiet words with old Mrs. Clement behind the counter. Nothing was said about the key. There was no need. Not yet. By the time she returned home, the kettle was singing on the hob. She made her tea, carried the tray to the sitting room, settled back into her chair, and took up her knitting once more. The grey wool slipped smoothly through her fingers. The needles clicked softly. Every so often, she glanced at the string bag resting beside her feet. The key was still there, quiet and unassuming. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small private smile. Ordinary objects, she had learned over many years, sometimes carried the most interesting stories, especially when they appeared where they had no business being. And outside, the thrush found its worm and flew off with a flutter of wings. The roses nodded in the breeze. The afternoon wore gently on. And in the peaceful sitting room of Miss Marple's cottage, the first thread of a quiet mystery had begun to unwind. Chapter 2. Something Slightly Unusual. Miss Jane Marple continued her knitting the next morning with the same unhurried rhythm, the grey wool growing steadily under her fingers. The sitting room fire burned low and steady, casting a warm glow across the hearthrug. Outside, a light mist hung over the village, softening the outlines of the houses and making the air feel cool and clean. It was the kind of September day that promised nothing dramatic, just the gentle passage of time. She had placed the small brass key on the mantelpiece the evening before, and beside the china shepherdess, and a framed photograph of her nephew Raymond, taken years ago in his Oxford days. The key looked quite at home there now, ordinary and unremarkable among the familiar ornaments. Yet every so often, her eyes would rest upon it, thoughtful, unhurried. By mid-morning, she decided a short walk would do her good. She put on her coat, tucked the key back into her knitting bag for safekeeping, and set out along the lane once more. This time she turned toward the high street, where the butcher, the baker, and the little general store stood in a neat row. The mist was lifting, and patches of pale sunlight began to appear on the pavement. At the post office, she met Mrs. Price, who was buying a packet of envelopes and chatting with the postmistress. Mrs. Price turned with a bright smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. How are you today?" "Very well. Thank you, my dear." "And yourself? The baby keeping you busy, I expect." Mrs. Price laughed softly, resting a hand on her rounded stomach. "Oh, he, or she, is quite lively already, kicking at all hours. But I'm managing. By the way, have you heard about poor Mr. Hargrove?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "No, nothing particular." "Is he unwell?" "Not unwell exactly," Mrs. Price said, lowering her voice a little, though the shop was empty, save for themselves. "Just a bit forgetful lately, according to Mrs. Sims. She was telling me at the Women's Institute meeting yesterday that he left his reading glasses in the refrigerator the other day. Put them there instead of the milk jug, she said, and then couldn't find them for half an hour." The postmistress chuckled from behind the counter. "Age catches us all, I suppose, though Mr. Hargrove always seems so sharp." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Indeed, small lapses do happen. Perhaps the spectacles were cold from being outside, and the refrigerator seemed a logical place at the moment." Mrs. Price nodded. "Perhaps. Still, Mrs. Sims says he's been asking about his keys more than usual. Wanted to know where the spare front door one was kept, even though it's always on the same hook in the kitchen dresser. She had to remind him twice in 1 week." "Twice in 1 week," Miss Marple repeated softly, almost to herself. "Yes." And he looked quite puzzled when she told him, as if he couldn't quite remember putting it there himself. "Poor man. I do hope it's nothing more serious." Miss Marple offered a few more sympathetic words, purchased her stamps, and left the shop. She walked slowly homeward, and turning the conversation over in her mind, like a piece of embroidery she was inspecting for loose threads. Forgetfulness. It was the obvious explanation for a key lying on a public path. An elderly gentleman, growing vague, drops something from his pocket without noticing. Perfectly natural. Everyone in the village would accept it without question. And yet, Mr. Hargrove had always been meticulous. His desk at the office had been legendary for its order. His garden tools hung in exact rows in the shed. Even his rose labels were written in the same small, careful hand. A man like that did not suddenly become careless with keys. Not without reason. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple took the key from her bag and placed it once more on the mantelpiece. She sat down, picked up her knitting, and let her thoughts drift. She tried the key in one or two places around the house: her own hall table drawer, the small cupboard under the stairs where she kept preserves, though she knew perfectly well it would not fit. The wards were wrong, the size was wrong. It was not her key. Then she remembered something else. Mr. Hargrove kept his garden shed locked at all times. He had once told her, during a conversation about pruning roses, that he never left it open because children sometimes wandered in and might hurt themselves on the secateurs. The shed key, he said, hung with the others on the dresser hook. But the key she had found was not a shed key either. Shed keys were usually larger, with broader bows for easier handling with gloved hands. This one was smaller, more delicate, more like a front door or interior door key. She considered the possibilities. Perhaps it belonged to the back door, or to the study. Mr. Hargrove had mentioned once that he kept that room locked since his sister's death, to preserve her papers undisturbed. But why would such a key be outside the gate, on the path? A visitor, perhaps, leaving hurriedly. A tradesman who had borrowed it and forgotten to return it. A neighbor borrowing sugar or borrowing a tool. Yet Mr. Hargrove did not often have visitors. He preferred his own company. Tradesmen called at the back door, and Mrs. Sims dealt with them. The postman left letters in the box by the gate. Miss Marple sighed softly, not in frustration, but in the gentle acceptance that some puzzles required patience. She rose, went to the kitchen, and put the kettle on for fresh tea. While it boiled, she stood at the window looking out over her garden, in watching a pair of blue tits dart between the bird table and the apple tree. The ordinary movements of ordinary creatures going about their day without hurry. When the tea was ready, she carried the tray back to the sitting room, poured a cup, and sat again. The key remained on the mantelpiece, catching the light now and then as the clouds moved across the sun. She thought of Mr. Hargrove's face, kind, reserved, a little lined with the years. She thought of his sister, who had died quietly after a long illness, leaving him alone in the house they had shared since childhood. She thought of the small changes she had noticed lately. The way he walked more slowly, the way his hat was sometimes set a little crooked when he raised it in greeting. Small things, insignificant on their own, but when added together, they formed a pattern, a not of simple forgetfulness, perhaps, but of something else: worry, unease, the kind of quiet anxiety that makes a careful man check his keys twice, then 3 times. Miss Marple sipped her tea. It was hot, comforting, exactly the right strength. She would wait. There was no rush. Mysteries, like good tea, revealed themselves best when allowed to steep. Outside, the mist had cleared completely. Sunlight lay warm across the lawn. Somewhere in the village, a church clock struck the hour, soft measured chimes that carried on the still air. And in Miss Marple's quiet sitting room, the second thread of the mystery slipped gently into place. Chapter 4. A Calm Contradiction. The days following Mr. Hargrove's passing slipped by with the quiet inevitability of autumn leaves falling one by one. The village of Saint and Mary Mead carried on in its usual gentle rhythm. The milkman's float clattered along the lanes at dawn. The church bell rang for matins and evensong. Children ran home from school with satchels bouncing against their backs. Yet beneath the surface calm, a small ripple of sadness moved through the community. Mr. Hargrove had been one of those steady presences people rarely notice until they are gone. Miss Marple attended the funeral on a crisp Wednesday morning. The service was simple and dignified, held in the parish church where Mr. Hargrove had sat in the same pew for nearly 50 years. The vicar spoke of a life well lived, quiet service, kindness without show, devotion to family and garden. A handful of mourners filled the front rows, Mrs. Sims dabbing her eyes with a folded handkerchief. The solicitor's clerk from the old firm knew a few neighbors and one or two distant cousins who had travelled up from the city. Miss Marple sat near the back, hands folded in her lap, listening attentively. Afterward, people gathered in small knots outside the churchyard gate. The air smelled of damp earth and chrysanthemums from the wreaths. Mrs. Sims approached Miss Marple with slow steps, her face pale but composed. "Such a gentle passing, Miss Marple," she said softly. "He looked so peaceful when I found him. Just didn't wake up." The tea beside the bed was quite cold. Dr. Haydock said it was the heart, had been weakening for some time, though none of us knew quite how much. Miss Marple offered a few quiet words of comfort, the sort that come naturally after many years of attending such occasions. Then, almost as though it were an afterthought, Archie asked, "Did you have any difficulty getting into the house that morning, Mrs. Sims?" The housekeeper shook her head at once. "None at all. I used my own key, the one he gave me years ago for the cleaning days when he was away visiting relatives. The front door was locked, just as it always was. Back door too. Everything quite normal and tidy. Even the breakfast things were washed and put away from the night before." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So the house was secure when you arrived?" "Perfectly secure. I had to unlock it myself. And when the doctor came, he remarked how orderly everything was. No sign of anything amiss." They spoke a little longer, about the flowers on the coffin, about who would look after the roses now. Then Mrs. Sims excused herself to speak with the vicar. Miss Marple remained by the gate a moment longer, watching the last of the mourners drift away toward the road. Back in her own sitting room, that afternoon, she settled into her armchair with a fresh pot of tea and the small brass key once more in her hand. She turned it over slowly, studying its plain shape, as though it might speak if listened to long enough. The contradiction lay plain before her now, though it had taken time to become visible. If Mr. Hargrove had died naturally in his sleep, if the house had been locked from the inside as Mrs. Sims described, if no window had been forced and no door left ajar, then how had this key come to lie discarded on the public path outside the gate? A forgetful old man might drop his own key while fumbling in his pocket on the way to the post office. But Mr. Hargrove had not left the house that final evening. Mrs. Sims had seen the lights go out at the usual hour, just after 9. And even if he had stepped out briefly, why drop the key so far from the door? Why not notice its absence when he returned and locked up for the night? Moreover, the key in her possession was not the one Mrs. Sims used. Mrs. Sims's key had a small leather tag attached, a practical touch she had added herself years earlier. This one bore no tag, no mark. It was unmarked, unclaimed. Miss Marple set the key down on the small table beside her and poured another cup of tea. The steam rose in a thin, peaceful spiral. She let her thoughts move without haste. The obvious story, the one the village had already begun to accept, was simple. An elderly gentleman, growing vague with age, misplaces small items. Glasses in the refrigerator, keys dropped carelessly. A quiet death in sleep. And nothing more. Yet the more she considered it, the less satisfactory that story became. Mr. Hargrove had not been vague in the careless sense. His questions about the spare key had not been absent-minded. They had been puzzled, almost searching, as though he suspected someone else might have moved it. Mrs. Sims had noticed the change in him too. The way he double-checked locks, the way he sometimes stood at the window, looking out at the garden, with an expression she could not quite name. And then there was the study door. Miss Marple had learned, through a quiet conversation with the vicar's wife, that Mr. Hargrove had kept his study locked for years. After his sister's death, he had said it contained private papers he did not wish disturbed, and that the study key had always hung on the same hook in the kitchen dresser, neatly labeled in his own hand. Yet Mrs. Sims had mentioned, almost in passing, that the study key had gone missing about 3 weeks earlier. Mr. Hargrove had searched for it himself, asked her if she had seen it, even looked through the drawers where it could not possibly be. He had never found it. The spare front door key had remained on its hook, the back door key too, but the study key had vanished. Miss Marple lifted the brass key again. It was not the study key. The wards were different, finer. But its presence outside the gate now felt less like an accident and more like a small, deliberate mistake. Someone had needed access to the house, quiet, unnoticed access. Someone who knew the routines, who knew when Mr. Hargrove retired early, who knew where the lights went out. Someone who had, perhaps, taken the study key first, used it once or twice, then returned it, or thought they had returned it, only to drop this other key in haste on the way out. The front door had been locked from inside when Mrs. Sims arrived. That much was certain. But a key can lock a door from the outside if the person using it is careful. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the teacup seep into her palms. The pace of the mystery remained slow, thoughtful. No sudden revelations, no dramatic discoveries, only the gentle accumulation of small facts that refused, politely but firmly, to fit the simplest explanation. Outside, the afternoon light began to fade. The first star appeared above the apple tree. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Miss Marple opened her eyes again and looked at the key resting on the table. It no longer seemed merely misplaced. It seemed left behind. Chapter 5. A Detail Revisited. A few days after the funeral, the village had already begun to fold Mr. Hargrove's passing into its everyday conversation, the way one tucks a bookmark into a half-read novel, gently, without disturbing the flow. The roses at Ivy Cottage still bloomed, though no one had yet trimmed the spent heads. The curtains remained drawn in the same tidy way. Life moved forward, soft and steady. Miss Marple decided it was time for a small, neighborly gesture. She spent the morning in her kitchen, making a pot of lemon curd, bright yellow, smooth as silk, scented with the zest of 2 fresh lemons from the greengrocer. She spooned it carefully into a small glass jar, untied a square of checked muslin over the lid with a narrow ribbon, and attached a handwritten label, "With sympathy and best wishes, Jane Marple." Simple courtesies, she had always found, opened doors more easily than questions. Carrying the jar in her string bag, she walked the short distance to Ivy Cottage. The gate latch clicked familiarly under her hand. The gravel path crunched softly beneath her shoes. She rang the bell once, polite, not insistent, and waited. Mrs. Sims opened the door after a moment. Her eyes were still a little shadowed, but she managed a small, grateful smile when she saw who it was. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. Please do come in. The kettle's just on." They settled in the kitchen, the warm heart of the house, and where the dresser hooks still held their neat row of labeled keys, and the table bore the faint scent of polish. Mrs. Sims set out 2 cups and saucers, poured tea, and accepted the lemon curd with quiet thanks. "It's just what he would have liked," she said, setting the jar carefully on the windowsill where the light caught its golden color. "He always said your preserves were the best in the village." They spoke for a while of small things, the weather turning cooler, the church flower rota, the new curtains. Mrs. Sims was thinking of making for the sitting room now that the house would have new tenants soon. Then, almost casually, Miss Marple asked, "I was wondering, Mrs. Sims, might I see the dresser hooks again? The ones where Mr. Hargrove kept his keys?" Only to satisfy a small curiosity of mine. Mrs. and Sims looked mildly surprised, but nodded without hesitation. "Of course. Nothing's been touched well, since that morning." They stood together before the tall oak dresser. The hooks were as orderly as ever. Front door, back door, garden shed, carriage. Each label written in Mr. Hargrove's precise, sloping hand. One hook, however, remained empty. "That's where the study key used to hang," Mrs. Sims said, touching the bare brass gently. "He kept that room locked ever since Miss Hargrove passed. Said it held her private papers and his own important documents. He didn't like anyone going in there, not even me for dusting. I respected that." Miss Marple studied the empty hook. "And you mentioned the key had gone missing?" "About 3 weeks ago, yes. He noticed one morning when he wanted to put away some new papers. He looked everywhere, drawers, pockets, even the whole table where he sometimes left things. Asked me twice if I'd moved it by mistake. I hadn't, of course. I never touched that hook unless he asked me to." "Did he seem very troubled by it?" Mrs. Sims thought for a moment. "More puzzled than angry," he said. "It's strange, Mrs. Sims. Things aren't where they should be anymore." Then he gave up looking and said he'd have a new one cut. But he never did. Perhaps he forgot. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She glanced toward the passage that led to the study door. "And when you found him that morning, was the study door locked?" "Locked tight, as always. From the inside. I had to fetch the spare front door key from the hall table drawer after Dr. Haydock arrived. Mr. Hargrove must have locked the study himself the night before he passed, and everything else was normal. The bed made up neatly, his book open on the bedside table at the page he'd been reading. Just quiet." Miss Marple let her gaze rest on the empty hook once more. Then she reached into her knitting bag and drew out the small brass key she had found on the path. She held it up quietly. "I picked this up outside your gate the morning before Mr. Hargrove passed. It was lying among the leaves. I thought at first it might be one of his, dropped by accident." Mrs. Sims peered at it, then shook her head. "That's not one of ours. Our front door key has the leather tag, remember? And the study key was bigger, thicker shank, different wards. This one's too small and plain." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But it has been troubling me, you see. A key that does not belong here, lying just outside the gate. And another key, the study key, missing from its proper place." Mrs. Sims looked from the key to Miss Marple's calm face. A faint line appeared between her brows. "You think someone took the study key?" on purpose. I think, Miss Marple said gently, that someone needed to enter that room without Mr. Hargrove knowing, quietly, carefully, and perhaps more than once. Mrs. Sims pressed a hand to her mouth for a moment. But why? There was nothing of great value in there. Just old letters, account books, his will. She stopped. Miss Marple waited. The will, Mrs. Sims whispered. He changed it not long ago. A small bequest to his niece in Bath, his sister's goddaughter. Nothing large, but enough that someone might have noticed if they looked closely. He told me about it when the solicitor came. I said it was only right. Miss Marple placed the key carefully on the kitchen table between them. And if someone had access to the study, say, late at night, while Mr. Hargrove slept, they could have read that new will, seen the change, felt threatened by it. Mrs. Sims sat down suddenly, as though her legs had grown unsteady. He'd been so careful lately, checking locks twice, asking about keys. I thought it was just his age creeping in. But perhaps he suspected something. Perhaps he knew someone had been in the house. Miss Marple reached across and patted the housekeeper's hand once, lightly. We do not yet know the full shape of it, my dear. But the empty hook, the missing study key, this misplaced key on the path, they are beginning to point in one quiet direction. Someone gained access. Someone who did not wish to be seen doing so. The kitchen clock ticked softly. Outside, a blackbird called from the holly tree. Mrs. Sims looked at the little jar of lemon curd on the windowsill, then back at Miss Marple. What should we do? For now, Miss Marple said, we wait a little longer. Let the facts settle. But we keep our eyes open. And we remember that small things, very small things, often tell the largest truths. She rose slowly, thanked Mrs. Sims for the tea, and took her leave. The gate latch clicked behind her once more. As she walked home along the lane, the afternoon sun slanted low across the fields. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from someone's bonfire. Miss Marple felt the familiar weight of her knitting bag against her side. The key was back inside it now, wrapped in a clean handkerchief. And with every step, the picture grew a fraction clearer. Not yet complete, but clearer. Chapter 6. Quiet Explanation. That evening, as the light outside Miss Marple's sitting room window faded from gold to soft grey, she drew the curtains against the coming night and lit the small fire in the grate. The flames caught quickly on the kindling, sending a gentle warmth into the room. She settled into her armchair with a fresh pot of tea on the low table beside her. Chamomile this time, mild and soothing, and the small brass key resting once more on her open palm. She spoke aloud, though no one else was present. It was a habit she had developed over the years. Putting thoughts into quiet words helped them settle into their proper shape, like smoothing the edges of a piece of embroidery before framing it. Mr. Hargrove was not, in the ordinary sense, becoming forgetful. She began softly. He was careful, perhaps more careful than ever before. When he asked Mrs. Sims twice in 1 week where the spare front door key was kept, it was not because he could not remember. It was because he feared someone else might have moved it. When he searched for the study key and could not find it, he did not simply shrug and order a new one cut. He puzzled over it. He wondered. And that wondering showed itself in small ways. Double-checking the locks at night, drawing the curtains earlier, walking less often around the village green after dusk. She paused to sip her tea. The cup was warm against her lips. The study key disappeared first. about 3 weeks before his death. Someone needed access to that room, quietly and without his knowledge. On inside lay his private papers, old letters, account books, and most importantly, the new will he had made. A small change, nothing dramatic, a modest bequest to his late sister's goddaughter in Bath. But small changes can feel large to someone who expects to inherit everything. Someone who had perhaps counted on the house, the garden, the savings, passing to them alone. Miss Marple turned the key slowly between her fingers. Its brass surface caught the firelight in brief flickering gleams. That person, let us call them the visitor for now, took the study key one evening when Mr. Hargrove was out at the parish council meeting, or perhaps simply in the garden, tending his roses. They entered the study, read the papers, saw the alteration. They understood at once what it meant. Less for them, more for someone else. Greed is a quiet poison, and it works slowly. But fear of losing what one believes is rightfully theirs works faster. She set the key down on the table and folded her hands in her lap. They returned the study key to its hook, or believed they had. But perhaps in haste, perhaps in nervousness, they took another key instead. The front door key, perhaps, or a duplicate they had acquired earlier. No matter. The important thing was access. Repeated, silent access. Night after night, while Mr. Hargrove slept upstairs in his neat bedroom, someone let themselves in with care. The front door was locked again from the inside when they left. That was easy enough with the key in hand. No windows forced, no noise made. Only the soft click of a latch, the faint creak of floorboards, avoided by knowing exactly where to step. In the study, or perhaps later, one in the kitchen, they tampered with his heart medicine. The capsules he took each evening were small, white, unremarkable. It would take only a steady hand to open a few, replace the contents with something gentle but cumulative. A sleeping draught, perhaps, or a mild sedative that taken over days or weeks would slow the heart just enough. No violence, no struggle, only a quiet deepening of sleep until one morning the heart simply did not wake. Miss Marple looked into the fire for a long moment. The logs settled with a soft sigh. The mistake, the one small mistake, was the key itself. In their hurry on the final visit, or perhaps on one of the earlier ones, they dropped it outside the gate, among the fallen leaves on the public path. They could not risk returning for it. Better to leave it and hope no one noticed. And better to let the story of an aging man's forgetfulness take its natural course. And it nearly did. Dr. Haydock saw heart failure, quite expected at 73. Mrs. Sims found the house locked, everything tidy, no sign of intrusion. The death appeared natural because it was meant to. Gentle, unquestioned. But the key did not fit that story. It lay where it should not have been. It belonged inside the house, on a hook or in a pocket. Its presence outside told of someone coming and going, someone who had no business being there after dark. And once that small fact was seen clearly, the rest followed. The missing study key, the questions about the spare front door key, the new will, the quiet anxiety in Mr. Hargrove's manner during his last weeks. All of them pointed to the same truth. Access had been gained, and access had been used, not for theft of jewels or money, but for something far more permanent. To remove an obstacle, to secure an inheritance before the ink on the new will had time to dry. She reached for her tea again, drank slowly. There was no need for confrontation, No raised voices, no dramatic scene in the drawing room. The truth revealed itself through logic and patience, through noticing that ordinary things were not quite ordinary when placed side by side. A key on a path, an empty hook, a changed will. A man who had begun to check his locks, not once, but twice. Human nature is very consistent, even when it tries to hide. Greed whispers the same things to different people in different times. Fear makes the same small mistakes. And kindness, true kindness, leaves traces too, though he misses. And Sims kept the house exactly as he liked it. The way she noticed his unease, but did not pry too deeply. The visitor was someone close enough to know the routines, the keys, the medicine on the bedside table. Someone who stood to gain most from the old, while remaining unchanged. A distant relative, perhaps. A cousin who had visited often enough to be familiar. Someone who smiled at funerals and spoke of dear Edwin with just the right note of sorrow. But sorrow, like everything else, can be arranged. Miss Marple smiled faintly, a small private smile of understanding, rather than triumph. The matter is clear now. Not exciting, not shocking, merely sad. A quiet betrayal carried out in the dark, undone by one small, misplaced key that someone else happened to notice. She rose slowly, carried the tea tray to the kitchen, in and rinsed the cup under the tap. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs. Tomorrow she would walk to the police station with the key wrapped in a clean handkerchief. She would speak to Inspector Craddock in her usual calm way, no flourish, no accusation. Only the facts, laid out plainly, one beside the other. The rest would follow naturally. For tonight, though, the fire burned low. The room was warm. The mystery had found its shape. Miss Marple returned to her chair, picked up her knitting once more, and let the grey wool slip quietly through her fingers. All was understood. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. The morning after her quiet fireside explanation, Miss Marple rose with the first pale light filtering through the lace curtains. She dressed carefully in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan. He pinned a small brooch to the collar, a modest amethyst given to her years ago by a grateful friend, and prepared herself for the short walk to the police station. In her knitting bag rested the small brass key, wrapped now in a fresh white handkerchief, and placed beside a neatly folded slip of paper, on which she had written, in her small clear handwriting, the main points of her reasoning. No flourish, no accusation, only the calm arrangement of facts. The village was still waking as she stepped out. Dew lay thick on the grass verges. A milk cart rattled past with its familiar clink of bottles. Smoke rose in thin blue columns from several chimneys. Miss Marple walked at her usual measured pace, nodding good morning to the postman and to young Tommy Pierce, who was sweeping the pavement outside the butcher's shop, for no one asked where she was going. In St. Mary Mead, people went about their business quietly, and Miss Marple's business was understood to be her own. At the small police station, a modest brick building beside the fire station, she was shown at once into Inspector Craddock's office. He rose to greet her with the same courteous respect he always showed, pulling out a chair and offering tea from the kettle that stood perpetually on the hob. "Thank you, Inspector, but I shall not stay long," she said, settling herself. "I have come about Mr. Hargrove's passing. There are one or two small matters that have been troubling me." She laid the handkerchief-wrapped key on the desk between them and unfolded her notes. In her gentle, unhurried voice, she explained everything. The key found on the path outside Ivy Cottage gate, the missing study key, the empty hook on the dresser, Mr. Hargrove's quiet anxiety about his own keys, the recent change to his will, the locked doors the morning of his death, and the cumulative effect of a sedative disguised as heart medicine. Inspector Craddock listened without interruption, his notebook open but his pen still. When she finished, he sat back, looked at the key for a long moment, then at her. "You've built quite a case, Miss Marple." Quietly, as always. "It was not built so much as noticed," she replied modestly. "Small things refuse to fit the simplest story. Once seen, the rest followed naturally." He nodded slowly. "We'll have the remaining capsules tested at once, discreetly, and I'll speak to the family members who stood to benefit most from the original will. There's a cousin, Mr. Lionel Hargrove, who visited fairly often in the last year. Lives in Cheltenham, but comes down regularly. He was at the funeral, of course." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I believe you will find him cooperative when the facts are laid before him plainly. The tests were swift and conclusive. Traces of a barbiturate derivative appeared in several of the capsules, enough, over time, to induce a peaceful but irreversible slowing of the heart. No great quantity in any one dose, just enough to accumulate. The capsules had been carefully opened and resealed. Only a close examination revealed the faint ridge around the join. When Inspector Craddock called on Lionel Hargrove at his hotel in the nearby market town 2 days later, the man listened in silence. There was no dramatic denial, no outburst. Only a tired sigh when the key and the laboratory report were placed before him. "I never meant it to end like that," he said at last, voice low. "I only wanted fairness. Edwin changed the will without telling me. That small legacy to the girl in Bath, it would have meant nothing to him, but it cut into what I had always expected. I thought if I could just delay things a little longer, make him sleep more deeply. I never imagined it would go so far." He confessed everything, borrowing the study key during one visit when Edwin was out, reading the documents, taking the key again later to enter at night, substituting the capsules over several evenings. The final night he had dropped the front door key in his haste to leave before the first light. He had not dared return for it. There was no trial in the public sense. Lionel Hargrove made a full statement, was charged quietly, and later pleaded guilty to manslaughter by administering a noxious thing with intent to injure. The sentence was lenient, several years, with consideration for his age and the absence of violence, but the village knew. Whispers faded quickly. People preferred to remember Edwin Hargrove as he had lived, kind, orderly, fond of his roses. Ivy Cottage did not stand empty for long. A quiet widow from the next village took the lease. She loved gardening and soon had the borders bright with late asters and Michaelmas daisies. The roses were pruned in due season. The study door was left unlocked and aired. Sunlight moved freely through the rooms once more. In Miss Marple's own cottage, life resumed its gentle pattern. The grey shawl for Mrs. Price's baby grew longer each day, and the stitches even and soft. One afternoon, the baby arrived, a small boy with dark hair and a hearty cry. Miss Marple delivered the finished shawl herself, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with narrow blue ribbon. Mrs. Price kissed her cheek and thanked her with tears in her eyes. Outside, the autumn deepened into early winter. Leaves drifted across garden paths and lanes, covering the spot where a small brass key had once lain unnoticed. The path was swept clean again. The gate latched securely, the house beyond it peaceful. Miss Marple sat by her window one late afternoon, knitting a new pair of socks for the vicar's son away at university. The light was soft, the fire crackled low. She looked out across her own garden, roses now pruned back for winter, lavender stalks silver with frost, and felt the familiar contentment of order restored. No great drama had marked the end of the matter. No crowds, no headlines. Only the quiet satisfaction that comes when small truths are seen and acknowledged, when harm is understood, and in time set right as far as human hands can manage. The key itself, returned now to the police station evidence room, had served its purpose. Its story was told. It could rest. And so the village of St. Mary Mead turned once more toward its ordinary days. Church services, Women's Institute meetings, the slow changing of seasons. People greeted one another in the lanes, shared small news over garden fences, lived their lives with the same gentle rhythm they always had. Miss Marple folded her knitting for the evening, placed the needles carefully in their basket, and rose to draw the curtains against the early dark. She paused at the window a moment longer, watching the first stars appear above the apple tree. All was as it should be, peaceful, orderly, understood. She turned away from the window, switched on the small lamp beside her chair, and settled once more with her book. The fire burned steadily. The house held its familiar quiet, and somewhere in the stillness of the night, the last small thread of the mystery slipped gently into place, leaving only calm behind. Dear listener, the tale is complete. The key has found its meaning, the house its peace, the heart its rest. Let the quiet of St. Mary Mead wrap around you now. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts soften and drift. The mystery is solved, the order restored. Sleep well, dear one. Good night. Chapter 8. A Gentle Epilogue. Weeks slipped into months, and winter settled softly over Saint. Our Mary Mead, like a clean white sheet drawn across a well-made bed. The first snow came lightly in mid-December, enough to dust the rooftops and outline the branches of the old yew in the churchyard, but not so much as to disrupt daily life. People walked carefully on the salted paths, exchanged quiet greetings, and carried on. The village had absorbed the sadness of Mr. Hargrove's passing the way it absorbed most things. With dignity, a little private grief, and then the steady forward motion of ordinary days. Miss Marple's cottage remained a small haven of warmth amid the chill. The fire burned steadily in the grate. The windowsills held pots of forced hyacinths, whose scent drifted through the rooms. The knitting basket beside her chair was never empty. She had finished the grey shawl for the Price baby long ago and moved on to a pair of woolen mittens for the vicar's youngest daughter, who had outgrown her last pair before the first frost. One crisp January afternoon, when the sun hung low and pale in a sky the color of old porcelain, Miss Marple received a visitor she had half expected. Mrs. Sims arrived at the garden gate carrying a small wicker basket covered with a cloth. She knocked softly, and Miss Marple opened the door with her usual calm welcome. "Come in, my dear. The kettle's just on." They settled in the sitting room. Mrs. Sims set the basket on the low table. Inside lay a dozen shortbread biscuits, still warm from the oven, and a small jar of quince jelly she had made from the last of the fruit on Mr. Hargrove's tree. "I thought you might like them," she said simply, and on the quince was his favorite. He always said it reminded him of his mother's kitchen. Miss Marple thanked her with genuine pleasure and poured tea. They spoke for a while of small, comforting things. The new curtains now hanging in Ivy Cottage, the way the widow tenant had replanted the herb border exactly as it had been, the Christmas service where the choir had sung in the bleak midwinter with particular tenderness. Then Mrs. Sims set her cup down carefully. "I've been thinking a great deal since everything came out," she said, "about Mr. Hargrove, about how he must have felt those last weeks, knowing something wasn't right, but not quite able to name it. It makes my heart ache to think of him lying there, checking the locks twice, wondering if he was imagining things." Miss Marple nodded slowly. He was not imagining. He was perceiving. Sometimes the mind sees more clearly than we give it credit for, even when the words to describe what it sees are hard to find. Mrs. Sims looked into the fire. "Do you think he knew, at the end, that someone he trusted had done this?" "I think he suspected," Miss Marple answered gently. "Not the full truth, perhaps, but enough to make him watchful, enough to make him careful. And in his own quiet way, he was protecting what he could: his home, his memories, the little changes he had made to his will. He did not go without resistance, even if it was only the resistance of a man who double-checks his keys." A silence fell between them, soft and unhurried. Outside, a light wind moved the bare branches. A few snowflakes drifted past the window like slow white moths. Mrs. Sims spoke again after a time. "The new tenant, Mrs. Ellison, she's kind. She asked me to stay on 2 mornings a week to help with the heavier cleaning until she's settled. I said yes. It feels right to keep things tidy there a little longer, as though I'm still looking after him, in a way." "That is a very good thing," Miss Marple said. "Houses remember care. They hold it in the polish of the wood, the scent of the linen, the way the light falls across a room. You are giving the house, and Mrs. Ellison, something precious by staying a while." Mrs. Sims smiled, small but real. "Perhaps. And the roses. She's already planning which ones to feed come spring. She says she'll keep the names he wrote on the labels: Peace, Queen Elizabeth, Mr. Lincoln. She doesn't want to change them." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Then the garden will remember him too." They finished their tea. Mrs. On Sims rose to leave, thanking Miss Marple once more for everything, for listening, for noticing, for speaking when speaking was needed. At the door she paused. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think mysteries were things that happened in books, dramatic, with chases and clever tricks. But this one, it was so quiet, so ordinary, and yet it changed everything." Miss Marple laid a hand lightly on her arm. "The quiet ones are often the deepest, my dear. They move beneath the surface like roots under soil. We do not see them until something small, a key on a path, an empty hook, brings them into the light." Mrs. Sims nodded, eyes bright. Then she stepped out into the cold afternoon, pulling her coat close. Miss Marple watched her walk away down the lane until she turned the corner by the almshouses. The snow had stopped, but the sky was clearing to a pale, luminous blue. She closed the door softly, returned to her chair, and took up the mittens once more. The wool was thick and warm, the stitches even and sure. Days continued to pass. February brought longer light, the first snowdrops pushing through the frozen earth beside the front path. The church announced a small memorial for Mr. Hargrove on the anniversary of his passing. Not a grand affair, only a quiet service with a few hymns and a reading from one of his favorite psalms. Miss Marple attended, sitting in her usual pew, listening to the familiar words. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Afterward, people lingered a little in the churchyard, speaking in low voices, and someone had placed fresh flowers on the new headstone, simple white chrysanthemums tied with garden twine. Miss Marple stood for a moment, reading the inscription. Edwin James Hargrove, beloved brother, kind friend, he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water. She smiled faintly, a private smile of recognition. Then she turned toward home. In her own garden, the first crocuses had opened, small brave flames of purple and gold against the dark soil. She paused to look at them, breathing in the cold, clean air. Somewhere, a blackbird sang, clear and hopeful. Back inside, she set the kettle on, arranged shortbread and quince jelly on a plate, and settled by the window with her knitting. The mittens were nearly finished. Soon she would start something new, perhaps a scarf for the postman's wife, who always had cold hands in winter. In the house held its familiar quiet, the tick of the clock, the soft crackle of the fire, the faint scent of hyacinths. Outside, the village moved through its afternoon routines, children coming home from school, a bicycle bell ringing, distant laughter. All the threads had found their place. The key no longer lay misplaced. The house no longer held secrets. The heart no longer carried unspoken worry. What remained was memory, gentle, orderly, and kind. Miss Marple looked out at the garden once more. A single snowdrop nodded in the breeze. She picked up her needles again and began the next row. Peace, she thought, was not the absence of trouble. It was the presence of understanding, and understanding, once reached, stayed. Chapter 9. The Last Light of Autumn. Spring arrived in St. Mary Mead with the tentative gentleness of someone returning home after a long absence. The snowdrops had given way to daffodils, then to early tulips, whose red and yellow heads nodded along garden borders like small flags of welcome. By late April, the air carried the sweet, green scent of new leaves and freshly turned earth. Birds sang from dawn until the light began to fade. Children played longer in the lanes before being called in for supper. Miss Marple's own garden had awakened fully. The hybrid tea roses she tended so carefully were already showing fat buds. The lavender bushes along the path had put out their first silvery grey shoots. The apple tree at the bottom of the lawn was covered in pale pink blossom that drifted to the grass whenever a breeze passed through. She spent her mornings there now, not hurrying, but moving with quiet purpose, tying in new growth, mulching the beds with well-rotted compost, pausing every so often to listen to the blackbird that had claimed the holly as his territory. One bright Saturday morning, she received an unexpected letter. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting firm but feminine. Inside lay a single sheet of notepaper and a small pressed flower, a single rose petal, pale cream edged with pink, still faintly scented after months between the pages of a book. The letter was from the goddaughter in Bath, Mr. Hargrove's late sister's namesake, now married, and the mother of 2 small children. Dear Miss Marple, I hope you will forgive this letter arriving unannounced. My uncle's solicitor wrote to me after everything became known, he explaining the circumstances of Uncle Edwin's passing and the small bequest he had so thoughtfully made. I had not seen him in many years, not since I was a girl, but the memory of his quiet kindness has stayed with me always. He once gave me a cutting from his peace rose and told me to plant it where I could see it from my window. I did, and it blooms every summer without fail. The news of how he died was painful, but knowing that someone noticed, that someone cared enough to understand what had happened, has brought a kind of peace. I wanted to thank you, not only for what you did, but for being the sort of person who still notices small things in a world that rushes past them. I enclose a petal from that same rose. It seemed right that you should have it. With deepest gratitude, Aunt Margaret Ellison, née Hargrove. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then carefully placed the pressed petal between the pages of her own copy of Palgrave's Golden Treasury, the book she kept on the small table beside her chair for quiet evenings. She sat for a long while, looking out at her garden, the petals' faint fragrance mingling with the scent of damp earth that drifted in through the open window. Later that afternoon, she walked to Ivy Cottage. The new tenant, Mrs. Ellison, no relation to Margaret, merely a coincidence of surname, had the front door standing open to air the house. She was in the garden when Miss Marple arrived, wearing an old pair of gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed straw hat. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Come to see how the roses are doing?" "I thought I might," Miss Marple replied with a small smile, "and perhaps bring you a little something from Bath." She handed over the letter and the pressed petal, explaining briefly. Mrs. Ellison read it in silence, then looked up with bright eyes. How lovely, and how fitting. This garden has always felt like it belonged to someone gentle. I'm glad it still does, in a way. They walked together along the paths. The peace rose was in full early bloom, large, creamy flowers flushed with apricot at the center, their scent rich and sweet on the warm air. Mrs. Ellison bent to inhale deeply. "Uncle Edwin would have approved," she said softly, though she had never met the man. He kept everything so orderly, so cared for. Miss Marple nodded. "He did. And now it continues." They sat for a while on the wooden bench beneath the apple tree, now heavy with young fruit. Mrs. Sims had joined them, now bringing a tray with tea and the last of her quince jelly. The three women spoke quietly, of gardens, of seasons, of the small continuities that make loss bearable. No one mentioned Lionel Hargrove by name. There was no need. The shadow had lifted long ago. As the sun began to slant lower, painting the brick walls gold, Miss Marple rose to leave. At the gate, she paused and looked back. The key, she said almost to herself, was never really about the door it opened. It was about the door someone tried to keep closed. Mrs. Ellison smiled. "And you opened the right one instead." Miss Marple walked home slowly, the evening air cool against her cheeks. Children called to one another from open windows. A dog barked once in friendly greeting. The church clock struck the quarter hour with its familiar measured chime. In her sitting room, she lit the lamp early, not because it was dark, but because the soft glow felt companionable. She took up her knitting once more, a baby blanket now in palest green for the next child expected in the village. The stitches moved steadily, rhythmically, like breathing. Outside, the first star appeared above the roofline of the house opposite, then another. The sky deepened from blue to indigo. Miss Marple thought, not for the first time, how strange and how comforting it was that the smallest object, a tarnished brass key, no longer than a finger, could hold within it an entire story of human feeling, human care, and human restoration. Not a grand tale, never meant for newspapers or crowded courtrooms, but a village tale, quiet, contained, and in the end, kind. She finished a row, turned the work, began another, when the fire crackled low. The hyacinths on the windowsill had faded, but left their scent behind. Somewhere in the garden, an owl called once, soft and far away. All the questions had been answered long ago. What remained was not mystery, but memory. Memory kept alive in blooming roses, in pressed petals, in the way certain houses still felt cared for, even after their owners had gone. Miss Marple looked toward the window, though the curtains were drawn against the night. She could not see the stars, but she knew they were there, steady, silent, unchanging. She smiled faintly to herself. Then she continued knitting. The blanket grew, stitch by stitch. The night deepened peacefully. And in St. Mary Mead, as in every small place where people still notice one another, the ordinary light of understanding burned on, quiet, warm, and sufficient. Now, Chapter 10, The Quiet. That follows. Summer returned to St. Mary Mead as though it had never truly left, only stepped aside for a season to let others take their turn. By July, the lanes were lined with tall grasses gone to seed, the verges bright with poppies and oxeye daisies, and the air hummed with the steady drone of bees moving from flower to flower. Windows stood open all day long, washing hung in neat rows across gardens. Children ran barefoot until their soles turned brown with earth. Miss Marple's cottage garden had reached its fullest expression. The roses were at their peak, peace producing bloom after bloom of creamy perfection. Queen Elizabeth, standing tall, with pink cups held high. Mr. Lincoln, deep crimson and velvet soft to the touch. She spent her mornings there with secateurs in hand, cutting stems for the house and for friends, always leaving enough for the bees. A small trug rested at her feet, already half full of flowers, destined for the church altar that Sunday. One warm afternoon, she received another small parcel, this time delivered by the postman, with a cheerful, "Another one for you, Miss Marple." Inside the padded envelope lay a slim, leather-bound notebook and a short note in the same firm hand she now recognized. "Dear Miss Marple, I have been keeping a garden journal since the rose-cutting Uncle Edwin gave me first bloomed. It seemed only right to send you a copy of the pages from this summer, the ones where I wrote about the peace rose and how it reminds me of stories my mother told me about him. Perhaps you will find something familiar in the descriptions. We planted a new one last month, a hybrid called Remember Me. The petals are soft apricot, fading to cream at the edges. Every time I see it, I think of quiet kindnesses and of people who notice what others overlook. With warmest thanks and best wishes for your own garden." Margaret Miss Marple opened the notebook carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, interspersed with small pressed specimens and pencil sketches. A leaf here, a bud there, dates and weather notes, observations about soil and sun. One entry, dated mid-June, read, "The peace rose opened its first full bloom today. The scent is exactly as I remember from childhood visits, sweet without being overpowering, like clean linen left to dry in sunshine. I wish Uncle Edwin could see how well it has done here. Perhaps, in some way, he does." She closed the book gently and placed it on the mantelpiece beside the china shepherdess and the small brass key, returned months ago by Inspector Craddock after the case was closed, now kept not as evidence but as a quiet reminder. That evening, she carried a vase of mixed roses to Ivy Cottage. Mrs. Ellison was sitting on the bench beneath the apple tree, now laden with small green fruit, reading a book in the last of the daylight. She looked up with a welcoming smile. "More beauties for the house," Miss Marple said, setting the vase on the small iron table. "They're doing splendidly this year." "They are," Mrs. Ellison agreed. "I've started keeping a little record, too. Dates of first bloom, which feeds seem to work best. It feels like continuing something he began." They sat together as the light softened. Mrs. Sims joined them soon after, bringing iced lemonade in tall glasses beaded with condensation. The conversation drifted lazily. The church fete next month, the new organist who played too loudly during practice, the way the blackbird still sang from the same holly tree every evening at dusk. After a pause, Mrs. Sims said quietly, "I still think of him sometimes when I walk past the study door. Not sadly anymore, just remembering how particular he was about things being in their place." Miss Marple nodded. Order was his comfort. And in the end, it was a small disorder, a key out of place, that helped bring everything back into balance. Mrs. Ellison looked thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder if he knew you would notice? That someone would see what he couldn't quite say?" "I think," Miss Marple replied softly, "he trusted the village to notice. Not in a loud way, but in the way small places do, through glances across fences, through conversations in queues, through the simple habit of paying attention. He lived quietly here all his life. He knew the place would remember him the same way." The sun slipped behind the roof line, turning the garden gold, then rose, then shadow. A bat fluttered out from under the eaves, hunting in silent arcs above the lawn. Somewhere down the lane, a child laughed, the sound carrying clear on the still air. Miss Marple rose at last. "I must be getting back. The midges will be out soon." They walked her to the gate. At the path, she paused and looked back at the house, its windows glowing now with lamplight, the roses catching the last color of the day. "Good night, ladies. Sleep well." "Good night, Miss Marple," they chorused softly. And thank you. Again." She walked home under a sky turning slowly to navy, stars appearing one by one, like small lanterns being lit in distant windows. The lane was empty, save for herself and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. Her steps were slow, unhurried. Her shadow stretched long behind her on the pale gravel. Inside her own cottage, she drew the curtains, lit the lamp, and settled into a chair. The knitting basket waited, the baby blanket long finished and given, now a simple pair of bed socks in thick cream wool for herself, practical, warm, comforting, against cooler nights ahead. She picked up the needles and began. The house settled around her, with its familiar sounds, the clock ticking, the fire murmuring low, the faint creak of old timbers cooling after the day's heat. Outside, an owl called once from the direction of the churchyard, soft, far, familiar. Miss Marple thought, as she sometimes did on such evenings, how every story, however small, leaves something behind. A petal pressed between pages, a rose still blooming under a different name. A habit of careful noticing passed quietly from one person to the next. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would ever appear in history books, only the gentle persistence of kindness, of attention, of memory. She finished a row, turned the work, started another. The lamp cast a warm circle across her lap. The wool slipped smoothly through her fingers. Somewhere in the village, a door closed for the night. A light went out. Another came on. And the quiet That deep, contented quiet that follows understanding wrapped the whole place once more. All was well,